Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we will be covering Chapter 3 of the International Macroeconomics video series. I'm working off the second edition by Robert C. Feenstra. I've provided a link in the video description for you to purchase the book on Amazon if you're interested. But let's get started. And before I do, I just want to kind of recommend that you guys pause the video midway. There's a lot of content that we're going to cover in this video, so it can be quite overwhelming, especially if you're looking at it for the first time. So I do recommend that you kind of watch it in little snippets. If you are cramming for an exam, good luck, get some coffee, get ready. Alrighty, let's get started. So we talked about in Chapter 2, the two key concepts that we talked about were covered interest parity and uncovered interest parity, so CIP and UIP. And so just as arbitrage occurs in the international market for financial assets, it also occurs in the international market for goods. The result of goods market arbitrage is that the prices of goods in different countries expressed in a common currency must tend to be equalized. So, the two concepts that important concepts are the law of one price, so loop, which is applied to a single good, and then the purchasing power parity, which we're going to be talking about a lot in this chapter. So PPP, I'm going to say that a lot, which is applied to an entire basket of goods. And so in the previous chapter, we talked about how the value of exchange rates or the value of products are equalized, using those exchange rates. So if you can get an exchange rate that's better in London versus Toronto, well then, there will be more buying demand in Toronto relative to London, and that will bid up the price in Toronto and bid down the price in London, and therefore eventually it will equalize. And so that's also done in the goods market in the long term. Now, the law of one price states that in the absence of trade frictions, such as transportation costs, and under conditions of free competition and flexible prices, identical goods in different locations must sell for the same price when expressed in a common currency. If the good can be freely moved between countries, both markets must offer the same price. This is defined as an integrated market. Okay? Now, why will prices be the same? Under competitive conditions and frictionless trade, arbitrage will ensure the outcome. If prices are higher in market 1 compared to market B, arbitrageurs will buy at a lower price in market B and sell at a higher price in market A. And so what will happen is that there will be selling demand, a higher selling demand in market A, which will push down the price in market A, whereas there will be higher buying demand in market B, which will bid up the price. Right, and eventually they will equalize. So buying demand in B will push up the price, and selling demand, blah blah blah, push it down. Now we can illustrate this, algebraically. So the relative price can be written as the relative price of this good equals the exchange rate, which is we're assuming that we're U.S. buyers, so the dollar is our domestic currency and the euro is the foreign currency, and so it's the exchange rate between the 1 euro and how many dollars you're going to get for that euro. The price of the foreign good, that foreign good, divided by that same good priced in the US. So the price of that good in the US, the price of that good in Europe, and the exchange rate between the dollar and the euro. And so if the ratio exceeds 1, the good is costlier in Europe, whereas if the ratio is below 1, the good is cheaper in Europe. Only when the ratio is exactly 1 is the market in equilibrium, and that's called an integrated market. And so let's actually look at an example. So you are a Canadian consumer. In Canada, the cost of an apple is $1.20 Canadian. In the US, that same apple costs 87 cents US dollars. Now the exchange rate is 1.32 for 1.32 Canadian dollars for every US dollar. Now we input this in the formula, so we put that 1.32, that's the exchange rate, the price of the foreign good, which in this case is the US good, right? And so that's 0.87. We multiply the 2 and then divide by 1.20. And what you'll get is 0.957. So that's the relative price of good G in the US relative to Canada. And so, as we talked about here, if the ratio exceeds 1, the good is costlier in the foreign market. If it's below 1, it's cheaper in the foreign market. So therefore, the good is costlier in Canada and cheaper in the US. So how does the law of one price further our understanding of exchange rates? So we can take this formula and then isolate and rearrange it and isolate for the exchange rate. So if we divide the domestic price by the foreign price, you can actually calculate the exchange rate. So, okay. So now we go on to the principle of purchasing power parity. So the difference between loop and PPP is simply that loop looks at one good, whereas PPP looks at a basket of goods. And because this is a macroeconomic course, we're not looking at the bottom of the economy, but an overarching view, right? And so PPP is the macroeconomic counterpart to loop. If loop holds for each good in the basket, it will also hold for the price of the basket as a whole. And so the algebraic representation of PPP is exactly the same. You have your exchange rate between the euro, the foreign currency, and the dollar. You have the price of the foreign currency divided by the price of the domestic good. Now PPP holds when price levels in two countries are equal. When expressed in a common currency, this is called absolute PPP. So if the ratio, the relative price, is 1, it is called the purchasing power parity holds true, and it is called absolute PPP. Now, the relative price of two countries' baskets, denoted as Q, is one of the most important variables in international macroeconomics, and it is known as the real exchange rate. So we talk about how real prices can be simply divided. You look at or the real money supply. And we'll talk about this later. So the real money supply is essentially taking a look at the current money supply, which is the nominal money supply, and dividing it by the price to get the real money supply. And that's the same concept over here. This is the real exchange rate. So the relative price is the real exchange rate. Now, if the real exchange rate rises, so if this result, this Q result, increases from, say, for example, 1.2 to 1.3, there is a real depreciation. So similar to how we talked about in the previous chapter, as E rises, that's considered a depreciation, and as E falls, it's considered an appreciation. If the real exchange rate rises, that's considered a real depreciation, and if the real exchange rate falls, we say that is a real appreciation. Okay, now the real depreciation equals a fall into domestic price. So why is that? Okay, so let's look at this. So if Q increases, therefore a real depreciation, what from this formula needs to change? So if we're looking at the domestic price, the domestic price falls. So we're dividing by less. Therefore, the result is higher. So the top level, say for example, is 10, and we're dividing it by 2. Okay, so the answer would be 5. Now, if we were dividing it only by 1, so the domestic price falls from 2 to 1, all of a sudden the result is 10. So it has increased, and therefore it's a real depreciation. And so a real appreciation, there is a rise in the domestic price. So when a country's prices increase, the real exchange rate appreciates relative to the foreign exchange rate. Okay, so purchasing power parity states that the real exchange rate is equal to 1. If the real exchange rate is below 1, similar to what we talked about with the loop and the example with the apple, then foreign goods are relatively cheaper than home goods. Okay, therefore the foreign currency is undervalued. If the home currency is above 1, then if the real exchange rate is above 1, then foreign goods are costlier. Therefore, the foreign currency is overvalued. Okay. And so this is more of a graphical example, or more of a illustration, not graphical. But this is absolute PPP, so you have your exchange rate, and you can isolate for the exchange rate, and then by dividing the price of the domestic good by the foreign good. And so the inputs, the exogenous variables, are the prices, and the endogenous variables, which is the output of the model, is the exchange rate. Okay. Now, absolute PPP involves price levels, but in macroeconomics, you're more interested in the rate of change rather than the actual variables to see how the economy has changed between period to period. So in this case, what we're looking for is the rate of inflation. Okay, and so let's look at the rate of depreciation, which is the change in the exchange rate. So the change in the exchange rate you take the exchange rate one period ahead, so t plus 1, subtract that from the current period, and divide by the current period. That's relatively simple to understand. Now, recall, how do we calculate the exchange rate? How do we calculate this E in whatever period we're considering? So remember, we're dividing the domestic price by the foreign price. So we can expand this formula to calculate for each by showing that. So really what happens, this formula is the same as this. So it's simply the change in the domestic price divided by the foreign price, all divided by the initial domestic price divided by the foreign price. We can expand that and isolate simply for the domestic price and the foreign price. So essentially it's the change in the domestic price divided by the domestic price minus the change in the foreign price divided by the foreign price. And eventually, the rate of depreciation will equal the difference between the domestic inflation and foreign inflation. Okay? So starting from here, we can calculate the rate of depreciation as the change between E in one period in advance minus the E in the current period divided by E in the current period. And that can be represented by the difference between the inflation rate domestically and the inflation rate in the foreign market. Okay? So If relative PPP holds, this implies that the rate of depreciation of the nominal exchange rate equals the difference between the inflation rates of two countries, the home and the foreign inflation rate. Now remember that relative PPP is derived from absolute PPP. So, the market has that relative price has to equal 1 for this to be true. Therefore, if relative PPP holds true, this implies that absolute PPP also holds true. Now, PPP does not hold true in the short term for 4 key reasons. One is transaction costs. There's also non-traded goods. So transaction costs are simply, again, like when we're talking about it, this is great in theoretical terms, and over the long term it is true, but in the short term the challenge is, okay, if this apple costs $1 and then in Canada, and the supermarket in the US changes the price of that apple today to $1.30, all of a sudden, the supermarket in Canada also needs to change that price right away for PPP to hold true in the short term. But that doesn't happen. Supermarkets are not paying attention to every single price in the U.S., and the U.S. consumers the U.S. customers are not paying attention to all the prices in Canada. But over the long term, you'll see that there's more buying demand in different areas because prices are lower in those areas, and eventually those prices are bid up, and so they equalize in the long term. So that's transaction costs. There's also non-traded goods. So, the quality of a chef, that talent, that's not a good that can be traded, So there are some people who will charge a premium because of that special talent. And probably the most important one is price stickiness. And prices are sticky due to menu costs. You as a business owner, you don't want to change your prices on a daily basis because that will scare away consumers. You want to have stable prices as long as you can before you need to change them to really account for any changes in PPP. Right? So price stickiness exists in the short term. Now, PPP does hold true in the long run, and it has been proven consistently when analyzing historical data. So this is a graph of relative price relative to the exchange rate, and eventually over the long term, you'll see that it does equalize and follow the projected relative price. Okay, and the speed of convergence, so the speed of that PPP equalizing, is that deviations die out 15% every year. So really the half-life, 50% of that deviation will be eliminated in 4 years. That's quite an important concept to understand as well. Now let's look at money. This is where I would pause the video, take a 5-minute break, drink some water, and then come back to this. But I'll go through it. So for money, we're going to start off with, what are the 3 key functions of money? There's a store of value, there's a unit of account, and there's a medium of exchange. You've probably looked at these concepts before, but if you haven't, the store of value, essentially money has its own worth. Like that $20 bill is worth $20, right? Because of the legal tender and the support of, the monetary authority and the government, they give it that store of value. There's also the unit of account. Money offers the ability to price goods in dollar terms. So without money, you can't really say that apple costs $1.20 because what are you pricing it at, right? So the money provides that unit of account, that ability to value something, and also, of course, the medium of exchange, where simply you can use that money to then purchase and exchange goods, depending on what you want. Now, you can measure the amount of money in an economy using the M scale. So M0 is simply the currency in circulation, M1 is the currency, M0 plus demand deposits, and then M2 is M1, which includes the currency in circulation plus demand deposits plus savings. And so illustrating that visually, you can see that M0 is the lowest. Then you have M1, which accounts for demand deposits, so it increases incrementally. And then with all those savings deposits, you'll see that M2 is significantly larger. And this is just to illustrate that there are different levels of the money supply. But when we're talking about a country's central bank and its control over the money supply, we're referring to the money supply that would be considered M0. Right? And the central bank can indirectly control the money supply by using monetary policy to influence the behavior of private banks while conducting open market operations. So essentially what that means is, how does a central bank control the money supply? Well, what it can do is it can buy and sell government bonds. And so that's considered an open market operation. If it sells government bonds, what it's doing is it's selling this bond to a consumer. So the consumer is using money to purchase that bond. And so the central bank receives that money while the consumer receives that bond. And essentially that central bank can retire that cash that was received. In a way, theoretically, that reduces the money supply, because the central bank will not just simply throw that money back into the economy. It's being taken away from the economy. So the economy can't use it because the economy spent it on that bond. the reverse of that is that, say, for example, a bank wants to buy a government bond. Well, it takes its own cash, which is not part of the money supply because it can just print as much money as it wants, really. And then it prints that money and it buys that bond. And so the central bank receives a bond and the economy receives that money, which therefore increases the money supply. And that's called an open market operation. Now, money demand, all else equal, is a rise in the national dollar income. So all else equal, a rise in national dollar income will cause a proportional increase in transactions. So essentially what this means is if your income increases, you want to use that extra money, right? That's money demand. So you're demanding more money to use for consuming or for whatever you want to do with that money. So your money demand increases as your income increases. And so we can illustrate this in, algebraically using the quantity theory of money, which states that money demand, MD, which we talked about, equals a constant, which the chapter won't talk about that, thankfully enough, but that constant can be covered in more advanced courses. So we'll just call it L. So money demand equals L times the price level times your income. So P times Y. So P is the price level times your income, which is the nominal income, right? And so that together equals nominal income. Now we can isolate we can divide that P out of the right hand side and move it over to the left hand side, and really, as we talked about before, now you have the real demand for money. So if you divide the money demand by price, you get real demand for money, whereas on the right hand side you now have that L constant times the real income. Okay, and so this is something that we'll be using a lot of. Now, we can combine PPP and the quantity theory concepts to build a simple model for exchange rates. Okay, so recall that with absolute PPP, the relative price can be used as the exchange rate between two countries. So remember that if we divide the domestic price by the foreign price, we get the exchange rate. Now, look at this formula. Where do we get that P? How can we get that P? Well, we know now that with the quantity theory of money, the money demand equals L times P times Y. So money demand equals a constant times nominal income. We can isolate for P by dividing money demand by L times Y, right? So M divided by L times Y equals P. Okay, and so essentially that's how we can calculate the price level. And so we calculate all you need to know is the money supply in the US, the L factor, which again we won't talk about that, and then real income in the US. And so if we divide M times L times Y, you'll get the price level in the US, and you can do that also for the foreign market. And so then you can take that P US divided by P Euro, and you can get your exchange rate. So when we're looking at the relative PPP formula, which calculates the exchange rate, we can expand that and we can say, okay, so the exchange rate equals the domestic price divided by the foreign price, which equals M the US divided by L US times Y US divided by the money supply in the foreign market times the L constant and real income in the foreign market. So it seems like a lot, and there's going to be more variables that we're going to look at, but nice and slow, pause the video and look at this. Remember, so this area right over here, we know this already. We've talked about this. This is the PPP theory. So if we divide the domestic price by the foreign price, we will get the exchange rate. Now we asked ourselves, how can we calculate the price level? Well, using the quantity theory of money, we know that the price level equals the money supply divided by L times real income. So we have to calculate the price level for the US and the euro, so we expand that. And then, of course, we can rearrange that formula to equal the money supply in the US divided by the money supply in the euro for the numerator, and divided by the denominator, which is the money supply, the L constant in the US times the real income in the US, divided by the L constant in euro times the real income in the foreign market. And so this is called the fundamental equation of the monetary approach to exchange rates. Nothing is new. We know the quantity theory of money. We know the relative PPP. So we just combine the two and we illustrate how we get that price level. Okay? So what does this imply? So this implies that, well, suppose the US money supply increases. So let's look at this formula once again, and suppose the only variable now changes is MUS. So the money supply increases. So what happens? Well, if the numerator increases and the denominator stays the same, the result increases overall, right? Because we're dividing by the same amount, but the top level increases. Whereas the bottom level over here, nothing changes. So this variable, this net result, will increase. This does not increase at all. So we're dividing by the same number, but we're dividing more of something. Therefore, the price level in the US will increase, and therefore the exchange rate increases. And so this makes sense. You don't need to use this formula all the time to analyze that, because think about it. So the greater the money supply, the less that dollar is valued, because there's more of it out there, right? So if you have 10 apples and they're priced at $1, if you now introduce 20 apples into the market, they're worth only 80 cents, because there's more of that apple. People have more access to that respective good, right? So when you increase the money supply, the exchange rate, E, increases. Therefore, there is a depreciation in the value of that exchange rate. Now, on the other hand, if you are increasing real income, think about it again. Say, for example, you have 10 apples. And so we're keeping the quantity the same this time, but now your real income as a consumer increases. All of a sudden, you can demand more, you can buy more. Therefore, the value of that apple increases instead of falling. So the exchange rate would actually fall, and therefore there is an appreciation in that exchange rate. And so we can also illustrate that numerically, but I won't walk you through that because that will just confuse you. Okay, so the model the model that was just presented analyzes the relative price levels. However, as stated before, we're not interested in just the variables, but the change in those variables, right? Because again, we're looking at time period to time period, right? So once again, we have the price levels and we know how to calculate them. But now we want to isolate that change in variable. So we want to isolate the change in the M and Y, because we're assuming that the L, the constant, will stay the same. Now we just want to see, okay, now if we want to know how P changes, we need to look at how M changes and Y changes between those two periods. And so that's essentially it. So these formulas, a lot of variables, we'll walk it through slowly. I know it can seem intimidating, but essentially this U, the UUS, is the change in the money supply. So you have the money supply in T plus 1, minus M in the first period divided by M in the first period, right? So that change in the money supply, and then there's also change in nominal income, illustrated by this little stupid fucking thingy over here. I don't know what it's called. And so that's essentially a nominal income in period T plus 1 minus nominal income in period T divided by nominal income in period T, right? And so essentially, we're talking about the price level and how the price level changes. So the only two variables that can change are the money supply and nominal income. And we're representing those changes by this formula and this formula over here. Okay? And so the difference between those two, so the difference between the rate of money supply growth and the rate of real income growth, is the inflation rate. So that change in P, what we talked about. And so this is very important as well. Okay? So I don't get it. Well, once again, think of it this way. If the money supply increases, but the rate of income growth stays the same, you have more money chasing fewer goods. The differential increases, therefore creating inflation. So you have more money, but you have the same amount of income. Well, businesses need to account for that increase in the amount of money chasing fewer goods, and therefore they raise the prices in order to account for that increase in the money supply. Okay? So now let's look at this formula once again. So we talked about how the exchange rate changes relative to, we talked about this earlier. So at the beginning of the video, we talked about how the exchange rate equals the difference between the inflation rate in the US and the inflation rate in Europe. Now, we know how to calculate that simply by looking at the difference between the money supply growth rate in the US and the real income growth rate. And so we can expand this formula to illustrate that the change, the depreciation in the exchange rate equals the difference between the US money supply and the US nominal real income growth minus the Europe's money supply growth minus Europe's real income growth. Okay, so if the U.S. runs a looser monetary policy in the long run, measured by a faster money growth rate, the dollar will depreciate. How is that so? Well, looking at these four variables over here, if we only change this one and we increase it, the differential increases for this overall, and then we're subtracting by the same number, so the net difference is higher. Therefore, E increases, and that means a depreciation. If the U.S. economy grows faster, the dollar will depreciate. E falls. So if we only change this one, so if real income increases and nothing else changes, then the differential will decrease over here, and we're subtracting by the same number, so the differential here will also decrease. Therefore, E falls, and that represents an appreciation. So let's look at an example. So case 1, assume the US and EU real income growth rates are identical and 0%. Assume also that the money supply is constant too. What happens if the US raises MS by 10%? So let's look again once at this formula. So we're saying that, okay, there's a 10% increase in this variable, everything else stays the same. So right away, we already know there's a 10% increase in M. For real income to remain constant, P must increase by 10% because the differential will increase by 10% over here, and this represents P, which is inflation rate. So inflation increases by 10%, and with that 10% in P, therefore the dollar depreciates by 10%. Okay, so we can go back to this formula and illustrate that. Now, what about case 2? So assume MS grows at a constant rate, A, but the US decides to raise the fixed rate to A plus B. What happens? Well, as we saw before, we need to represent that change. So there's an increase of B and M's growth rate. For real income to remain constant, P's growth rate must also increase by B, and the real exchange rate depreciates also increases by B. So that real exchange rate depreciation also increases by B, and we can illustrate that graphically. So the growth rates are the real money supply does not change, and the growth rate U over here. But when we represent that change in the growth rate, well, the money supply changes the growth rate. Therefore, that change in the growth rate of the money supply needs to be accounted for by the price level. So inflation increases, and when inflation increases, the exchange rate increases, which represents a depreciation in that exchange rate. Okay, what about case 3? So suppose Europe has a 5% annual rate of change of money and a 2% rate of change of real income. So money supply increases by 5%, whereas real income increases by 2%. Now, the US has a 6% rate of change of money and a 2% rate of change of real income. What is the change in the E? Right? So Europe, so this area over here, the difference between 5% and 2% is 3%. And inputting the numbers for this side, there's a 6% rate of change of money, which 6% goes over here, and then 2% goes over here. And so that's 4%. So you have 4% minus 3%. That means the inflation differential between the US and Europe is 1%. Therefore, the exchange rate must depreciate by 1%, right? So that's what happens. So what about hyperinflation? So we talked about how the exchange rate depreciates by 1% because there's an inflation differential of 1%. Well, when inflation rises to a sustained rate of more than 50%, so not 1%, not 2%, but 50%, this occurs when a government faces a budget crisis and is unable to borrow money. Therefore, they print money to cover their needs. And so, as we talked about, when the money supply increases and that growth rate increases, and in this case, it increases by a very significant margin, the money supply expands by 20-30%, well, that 20-30% needs to be matched by a 20-30% increase in the price level. Therefore, inflation is 20-30% domestically, right? And that's hyperinflation. In the case of hyperinflation, PPP usually holds in the short term because they're so large, eventually PPP moves that fast, right? As large depreciations and inflation reactions are compressed into short periods of time. So during hyperinflation, the usual money demand illustration, money supply and money demand, is money supply is straight because it's only controlled by the central bank, whereas money demand is decreasing, right, horizontally, because as the interest rate increases, the cost of holding that money increases, and therefore the money demand falls, whereas if the interest rate falls, the money demand increases because the cost of holding money becomes less. But when you're looking at money demand during hyperinflation, that curve is not straight anymore. It actually kind of curves out and almost flattens out. And eventually, if you find yourself that your money supply is over here, increasing it by an incremental amount or even a significant amount won't really change the overall nominal interest rate that much. It won't be as effective anymore. Okay, so this makes sense. If the money supply in people's pockets is rapidly turning into worthless paper, they would reduce their money holdings and therefore lower demand significantly. And what you'll see is that money demand falls significantly during that period. So what is the benefit of holding money? Well, individuals can conduct transactions in proportion to their income. But what is the cost? And I already talked about this referring to the nominal interest rate. The cost of holding money is not earning interest on that money if you were to put it into a savings account, right? So the nominal interest rate is the cost of holding money, whereas the benefit of holding money is being able to conduct transactions. So when your nominal income increases or your real income increases, the demand for money increases and the overall net benefit increases. Whereas if the nominal interest rate increases, the cost of holding money increases and therefore you want to reduce your holdings. So all else equal, a rise in national dollar income will cause a proportional increase in transaction and hence an aggregate money demand. So the money demand curve shifts up. All else equal, a rise in the nominal interest rate will cause the aggregate money demand for money to fall, and so therefore it will fall. Right? So the following is the real money demand function. So we already illustrated it. It's simply the money demand divided by the price to account for demand for real money, multiplied by real income and L. Now we said before that L was just a random variable. We're not going to really talk about it. Now we can represent L as a decreasing function because L represents that relationship between money demand and the nominal interest rate. Okay, so the downward slope of the demand curve reflects the inverse relationship between demand and the nominal interest rate. So when the nominal interest rate is higher, demand is less. When it's lower, it's higher because the cost of money falls, right? And so this now becomes a decreasing function. That's all we're doing. We're not expanding it beyond that. We're simply saying that, okay, this L will change when the nominal interest rate changes, okay? So now let's go back to the UIP approximate. So in the previous chapter, we talked about how the expected rate of depreciation for an exchange rate equals the difference between the net dollar interest rate and the net euro interest rate. We talked about that. We covered that in the previous chapter, so go back to that video if you want. Now, relative PPP, what we talked about in this chapter is that the rate of depreciation equals the inflation rate differential between domestic inflation and foreign inflation. So we can actually merge these two together to say that the nominal interest rate differential must equal the nominal inflation rate differential. So based on this equation, a rise in expected inflation in a country will lead to an equal rise in the nominal interest rate. This is the Fisher effect. You've heard this many times in many other courses, right? The Fisher effect links inflation and nominal interest rates under flexible prices. In addition, as nominal interest rates rise, money demand will fall. So say, for example, the price level increases in the U.S. represented by an increase in the inflation rate. So the inflation rate differential needs to be also represented by this. So the nominal interest rate in the U.S. must also increase in order to represent that same increased differential, right? So real interest rate parity implies that arbitrage in goods and financial markets alone is sufficient, and in the long term, to cause the equalization of real interest rates across countries. Okay, so now we revisit the fundamental equation of the monetary approach to exchange rates. The only difference is now that we allow L to vary as a function of the nominal interest rate. So we've already looked at this formula. The exchange rate equals the domestic price divided by the foreign price, which we can account for by dividing the money supply in the US divided by L times the real income. Now the only change is that we're making L the constant. We're representing that inverse relationship between L and the nominal interest rate. So if we were to increase the nominal interest rate over here, what would happen is L would become smaller and therefore the overall price level would increase. Okay, so we re-examine the forecasting problem. So case one, so we talked about this already. You have the US and Euro. They both have the identical growth rates, but now the US raises the money supply by 10%. So there's a 10% increase in the money supply. Real income remains constant. So P must also increase by 10%, and therefore the dollar depreciates by 10%. So we covered this answer before. Now that L is influenced by I, which changes due to inflation rate, the story is different. So the money supply increases by 10%, which results in a 10% increase in inflation. Now, the Fisher effect states that if inflation increases by 10%, the differential between domestic inflation and foreign inflation increases by 10%. Therefore, the differential between the domestic interest rate and foreign interest rate must also increase by that 10% margin. So U.S. interest rates will also increase by 10%. real money demand falls. Right, with the 10% increase in P, therefore the dollar depreciates by 10%. So essentially, now that we are accounting for that inverse relationship represented by the L constant, we are saying we can also illustrate how the interest rate changes. So we know how the money supply change affects prices and the exchange rate, but it also affects the real interest rate. And that's essentially the monetary approach, which shows that in the long term, all nominal variables, the money supply, the interest rate, the price level, and the exchange rate are all interlinked. Hence, monetary policies can radically affect many economic variables. An overarching aspect of a nation's economic policy is the desire to keep inflation within certain bounds. To achieve this, they set nominal anchors in an attempt to tie down a nominal variable. And you probably, if you've listened to any economic policy news or follow the financial markets, you always see that, especially in the U.S. and Canada, the inflation target is 2%. That's their nominal anchor. For them, inflation is very important in order to keep that inflation differential between Canada or the U.S. and foreign markets in order to then control the overall interest rate, right? So let's look at the usual three monetary regimes and their targets. So usually countries can target either the exchange rate, the money supply, or inflation plus the interest rate policy, because they're interlinked. If you're targeting inflation, therefore you're also targeting the interest rate, right? So those are usually the three. And nowadays it's very popular to use number three, the inflation target, because that's usually provides the most control in the current markets. Before, the target used to be the money supply or the exchange rate. And especially for Canada in the 1980s, when they had a huge inflation crisis, they struggled with this. And so through several regimes, they eventually found that the inflation target was most effective for their central bank. Okay, so now recall the relative PPP equation, which states the rate of depreciation equals the inflation differential. Okay, so if you rearrange, so we talked about how the rate of depreciation, the change in E, is represented by the difference between the home inflation rate and the foreign inflation rate. But if we were to move the foreign, so it's essentially the inflation rate of H minus the inflation rate at F. If we move the inflation rate of F over, it now becomes added to the rate of depreciation. So really, we can isolate for home inflation and say that home inflation equals the rate of depreciation plus the foreign inflation rate. So for an exchange rate target, what you can do is you can target the rate of depreciation. The foreign inflation rate is, an exogenous variable, and you need to account for that. But the nominal anchor for you is that rate of depreciation. And by controlling this and adjusting relative to the foreign inflation rate, you can control the overall home inflation. Okay? So what about the money supply target? And so I'll just talk to the variables here. So we once again talked about how inflation equals the difference between the money supply growth rate and the real output growth rate, so real income growth rate. Now, if we target the money supply and under a regime where you target the money supply growth rate, well, this can also influence inflation. Overall, if real output increases, then you will also want to increase the money supply in order to account and keep that differential the same, in order to keep inflation the same. Whereas if the economy is experiencing a recession and they need to, real output growth falls, then you need to also reduce the money supply in order to keep that differential the same. And that's actually one of the failings of this model, because under this target, if you want to target inflation at one certain level and the nominal anchor is the money supply, if there's a recession, you have to restrict the amount of money supply, which can be very damaging and actually extend that recession. So that's why a lot of people don't follow this. And the most popular is this one, and this is what a lot of developed markets do. They have the anchor variable, the nominal interest rate is their variable, and by controlling the nominal interest rate, which is much more easy with central bank mechanisms, relative to the differential of the world real interest rate, they can control their inflation rate. Okay, and so this is one of the formulas that we covered in the previous chapter and we talked about earlier in a few slides. Okay, so these are the monetary regimes. The three key ones are the exchange rate target, the money supply target, and the inflation rate target. Once again, let's go through them. So for the exchange rate target, by rearranging the relative PPP formula, you can control the home inflation rate by controlling your rate of depreciation and the exogenous variable of foreign inflation. For the money supply, you can control your home inflation rate by controlling the money supply growth relative to the exogenous variable of real output growth. Now, with the inflation target, you can target inflation by controlling the country's nominal interest rate relative to the world real interest rate. So those are the three policies. In addition, whenever target choice is made, a country that commits to a target as a way of nominal anchoring sacrifices monetary policy autonomy in the long run. So by committing to this, as we talked about before, so with this money supply growth, again, if output were to fall, they would have to lower the money supply in order to keep that differential the same for inflation to remain the same. So they don't really have that autonomy to say, okay, in this recession, we want to increase supply of money so that we can increase that, the velocity of that money. But you can't do that because you lost that monetary autonomy when you said that this was your nominal interest rate anchor. Okay? So other than that, an appreciation of the importance of nominal anchors has transformed monetary policy, making an inflation performance throughout the global economy in recent years. In the 1970s and 1980s, most of the world was struggling with high inflation. In the 1990s, policy was designed to target that. In addition, central bank independence has fostered longer-term thinking. So central bank independence simply states that the central bank is not dependent upon the political parties that are elected and their overall objectives. They are independent and make the decisions based upon what's good for the economy. And so policy has changed across the years, as I talked about with the 1980s and how Canada struggled with the different nominal anchors that they were trying out. Other than that, that's the end of this chapter. This was a 40-minute video, holy moly, but again, it is quite a chunky chapter. If you are interested in buying the book, once again, I've provided a link in the video description. I have gone on for such a long time, so please show any amount of support by either liking the video or subscribing to my channel. If you are interested in financial markets, interested in economies and how I analyze economies, I apply some of these topics in the research that I publish on Seeking Alpha. So I do recommend that you check out my profile on Seeking Alpha by clicking the link in the video description as well. Other than that, guys, have a great day.